It's only in the last 200 years or so that human beings have really been able to properly conceive what the Great Barrier Reef really is, the biggest organic thing on the planet. For a long time, people just saw it in bits because it was too big to see the whole. A 2,600 kilometre chain of individual islands and reefs built by tiny, tiny things. In fact, for a long time, the reef was regarded as a terror, a place where your ship could be torn up and you could be left marooned or smashed to pieces. Now, it's seen as a planetary treasure. And when you go there, it does tend to change you just a little bit, make you aware of how lovely and dangerous the world can be. Ian McCalman is an historian whose magnificent book is called The Reef, A Passionate History, and it's become a bit of a classic, earning praise and awards all over the world. It's a book that contains 12 stories of human encounters with the Great Barrier Reef. Hello, Ian.
Hi, Richard. Thanks for that lovely introduction.
It's a pleasure, and what a beautiful book too, with these beautiful images on the front of fish that were painted, and we'll come to that soon too. Let's start with your first encounter with the reef, which happened back in 2001 as part of a BBC reenactment thing. Can you just explain a bit about what that project was?
Yes. Well, first of all, I didn't realise exactly what it was when I got into it. I think it's essential to understand that. I understood it to be a film series, a TV and film series done by the BBC and the Discovery Channel that would do a kind of gentle sail through the reef, and a variety of experts would pontificate about what it was like in Cook's time. And I was to be a historian expert. So that was what I thought I was getting into. What I found when I actually got into it was Big Brother at sea. And historians might have been experts in theory, but they were actually able seamen, you know.
So the Beeb isn't above reality TV. They just need to put academics as the guinea pigs in there.
Exactly. And that's exactly what we were. We were a kind of, a sop to the pretense that this was about ideas, when it was really about the destruction of the body and mind.
Yeah, so how realistic was this as a reenactment then of Cook's voyage?
Well, it was realistic in some ways. The most unrealistic side of it was full of very youthful and athletic people who were good to look at it on television, girls as well as boys. So that was unrealistic. But they did go to great lengths to try and make it as unpleasant as possible. So, for example, they got the biscuit, the hard biscuit that you eat, made to an original recipe in the Goulburn jail.
Right.
And then presumably captured it from them so they didn't bash down the bars with it.
It was proper hardtack, was it?
Oh, my God. 5 people broke their teeth on it.
Oh, yeah, because it's almost inedible hardtack, isn't it?
It is. It's really, and, you know, we know that it was heavily weevilled in their time, which would have softened it up a bit. You sort of scrape at it on the side of your teeth. You don't bite it. In fact, we tossed them overboard and you'd see the reef sharks kind of taking a bite and then rearing back, you know.
Unpleasant, unsuitable for sharks. And was this on a boat that was kind of like a replica of the Endeavour?
It's an exact replica of the Endeavour. And what they did was to get rid of what they call the 20th century, which they use now, and restore it, in effect, to an 18th century ship. So the idea was that we would, as far as possible, sail through the reef under 18th century conditions.
And what were the sleeping conditions like?
Well, the sleeping conditions were appalling because we were able seamen were packed together like sardines in this rather small forecastle. Actually 3 deep in terms of lying in these hammocks. And I had a very large man, 250-pound man, with his bottom right in my face most of the time.
You just said we able seamen. I thought you were brought on board as a consulting historian.
They decided that the people to be treated with cabins were the scientists. It's just like life, you know, if you're an academic. And so the historians, and there are quite a few of us, were brought in whenever they needed us, but we were able seamen all the rest of the time.
Nonetheless, there were some Aboriginal elders on board.
There were.
What were your conversations with them like?
I had a terrific time with these guys. There were only three of them, and they were in my mess, as they call it, which meant the small group that fed together. And they were great guys. They were actually young. They called me the old fella. But they were really great guys who lived and brought up on the reef, and in the evening they used to tell stories about what it was like. Stories that were both exhilarating but also very, very sad, about them being moved around all the time, from place to place. How they kept any families or kin or anything intact is a miracle.
And when they spoke about the reef, or that part of the reef that they were familiar with, that was part of their country, how did they speak about it?
Well, they did speak about it as country, as a living thing. It was really, really fascinating to hear inanimate things talked about as though they were living. They also spoke about it as though it was a kind of mate, not reverential, but as a mate, as a friend, someone you lived with, you argued with, you fooled around with, you had a great time. It was really interesting.
How about your first then encounter with the reef? How did that affect you, just the sight of these places, and the fish, and the water, and all that sun?
Yeah, absolutely. We had two really wonderful moments, I think, that I can recall. One was quite a scary one, when we were actually going through the very narrow gap that was the channel that Cook found eventually to get out of the reef, just north of Lizard Island. And it was very narrow, and you were sailing through it. You could see these great jagged rocks, like huge teeth, just on either side of you. We were really quite edgy. There was not much room to spare. And on another occasion, we did stop and we swam in amongst actually at Endeavour Reef, we swam in amongst the coral where the boat had been wrecked, and it was fantastic. Yeah.
I think if you can visit the reef, I've only been to the reef once, but if you go there and you don't have that terrifying, life-threatening experience from a cyclone or a shark, or from being, having your ship torn up, you can have this kind of day there. And I think this happens to everyone who goes there. You get this thought in your head and you ask yourself, why shouldn't I spend the rest of my life here?
Exactly, Richard. You do. You do feel, I want to go troppo.
Yeah.
And you do know, we did meet people who live on these islands and who have, in a sense, changed their lifestyle and their rhythms of life so that they are accommodating with the sea and the sun and the fish, rather than with trams and buses and work.
How should we comprehend such a thing as vast as the Great Barrier Reef? As one big thing, or as a kind of constellation of smaller things?
I think you have to, when you're there, you have to comprehend it as a constellation of smaller things, of islands and of reefs. That's how you encounter it. It's just too big to view. But I've looked at parts of it from a helicopter, and then, of course, the astronauts have seen it from outer space. It's the only thing you can see, organic thing on Earth.
It's the only organic thing you can see on Earth. Wow.
Yeah. It's the size of Britain and Ireland put together. It's bigger than Japan. I dazzled Americans by saying that it's half the size of Texas.
How is it shaped? What made it the way it is?
Well, it's really, if you can imagine the shoreline extending out, say, another 100 kilometres or 200 kilometres in some places, and sinking.
That was once land, then?
Yeah, it subsided. So that was once land. If we were able to really go deeply under the reef, you would find caves where Aborigines had been. You might even find remnants of them because they were running around there, and as were kangaroos. So this subsided very slowly, and as it subsided, the coral grew up. So it is, in a sense, just a huge extension of the coastline.
So the hard part of the reef, the bony part, is that the coral, or is it the skeleton the coral leaves behind?
It's both, yes. The polyp, the little creature, makes a skeleton to protect itself. So it doesn't leave it behind. It actually protects itself with that. But it dies. The polyp dies when it can no longer reach light. And so what you're left with is a skeleton that is dead, a huge mountain of dead coral that turns into a kind of wall, like an enormous rock. But all the time, the live coral is just the fringe on the top, because coral can't live if it can't get light.
So that's the result of, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years of this. So in one way you could look at it as a kind of a great big bony spine of a superorganism.
Absolutely. It's a very felicitous phrase.
I mentioned there that at the start that we see it today as paradise. It's sold as a kind of glamorous international tourist destination, and it is like a paradise. But it's a recent thing, isn't it? It's a very recent thing.
Very recent thing. I mean, first of all, imagine Cook sailing in that boat. It's got no manoeuvrability at all. And the reef is just like a minefield. He couldn't have, had no maps to navigate, and yet he was navigating this lumbering great boat through tiny little, areas, and where there are enormous tides and mud flats and all kinds of things. So it was a frightening place, and it destroyed a lot of ships.
Let's talk about Cook's story, Captain Cook's story. He went and saw Botany Bay, said this is a bit of all right, went further north, up north, and then he entered the reef. But I suppose he would have had no idea what he was entering at all then, Ian.
No, he had no idea he was entering anything. He just sailed along. The reef was, when he entered it, at the mouth of the reef, it was 200 kilometres out to sea. So he didn't see anything. He noticed that the waters were a little calmer than they'd experienced. So he might have thought there's something that's probably making them calmer. But he had no idea there was any coral there or any reef. For 800 kilometres he sailed without knowing he was in the reef.
Right, and through that 800 kilometres he would have been going, what is this place and why is it so hard to navigate my way through it and why is this so dangerous?
Yes, it hadn't become as hard. You see, the reef is, when it begins, it's like a fish trap. It's very wide entrance, and so you can sail along for quite a long time. You might come to the odd sort of shallow as you're sailing along, but he would have assumed that's just rocks, nothing to do with coral. So for quite a long time, you're not being troubled, but the reef is cutting in, and gradually, of course, you come to the point where you encounter the coral aspects of the reef.
So he must have thought he must have realised at some point he was entering a kind of a labyrinth then.
Once he hit the reef, he knew it must be coral, because he'd gone from very deep water suddenly to this shallow, and he'd hit it, which he knows, of course, that you get coral reefs growing up in very deep water.
So what happened to his ship then, the Endeavour, when he hit the coral?
Well, he smashed a big hole in the ship, and they were actually impaled on the coral, and they had to try and heave it off when the tide came back. But the really extraordinary thing about it is that they only survived because there was a midshipman who did this system of stitching up sheep dung and also a bit of wool and pulling it over the wound so it was sucked into the wound.
You got a Band-Aid made out of sheep dung.
Exactly. It's a handful of sheep shit that was holding them together.
What an Australian solution.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
To the problem. So how long was he stranded, he and the crew stranded there around the place we now call Cooktown?
Well, actually they were stranded in the area for a longer time than they were on the land. On the land itself, they were there for about 6 weeks. When they were actually marooned with the boat careened, and they were working on the boat there. But I think it's helpful to think of them as marooned, as the first shipwrecks, in effect, of European shipwrecks.
And what was their encounter with the local Aboriginal people like?
It was very, how to put it, the Europeans found it disturbing because they were hoping to get food from these indigenous people. They thought they would trade like they did in the Pacific, but they weren't interested in tic-tacs and beads and mirrors. They just chucked them away. And they were skittish. They weren't very keen to make contact. They only made contact because the Europeans, who were really suffering from deprivation of food, and many of them had scurvy, found a whole series of turtles, which really, in effect, belonged to the locals, and they put them on board, 13 of them, these massive 200-pound turtles. And,
Right.
of course, they were stealing.
Right, and that was seen as stealing.
It was seen as stealing, yeah.
Did hostilities break out at that point?
10 warriors came on board and asked, in effect, by signals, give us a turtle, because as a kind of gift for, request. And Cook refused, and his men refused. So the indigenous people got very angry, and they jumped ashore, and they set the grass alight. And actually, the day before, all of the equipment and the gunpowder and everything had been in a tent there. And it would have all have exploded. That would have been the end of that. But in fact, they managed to stop it. But they shot one of the indigenous people. So that was the beginning of a sort of tragic confrontation over resources, really.
And how did that end up? Was there a reconciliation effected in the end?
There was a reconciliation which was initiated by the indigenous people. We now know, thanks to contemporary indigenous people, that this area was a kind of special place where you had peace meetings and you conducted ceremonies and rituals.
Right, just by the sheer coincidence?
So lucky.
Well, I would have thought normally they would have insisted that one of Cook's men allow himself to be speared if one of their guys had to be shot.
They should have, really.
They didn't?
But no, they didn't. They were very... I think it should be something that we celebrate in Australia. The first reconciliation, and it was initiated by the indigenous people.
So what did you come to understand? You'd been an historian of Cook's voyage before you went on this crazy BBC reality TV show, Cook Tour reenactment. Well, nonetheless, from that experience, what did you come to understand about Cook's voyage that you didn't know before?
Well, I guess two things. One is how horrible the life of an 18th century sailor was, and just how complicated a ship was. I mean, that ship is a very complicated machine with 112 ropes that you have to memorise and get them right. So there was that sort of technical side of things that was different. The other thing was just for me, it was the sheer beauty of the reef. I hadn't been and never sailed through it, and sailed through it on a sailing ship, which doesn't make a noise and frighten the fish and the birds. It was exquisite, and we passed all these beautiful islands and this amazing place, and I fell in love with it, really.
Cook stopped at Lizard Island, and you did too.
Yes.
What happened to you while you were in Lizard Island?
We did a walk. The historians did a walk up to where Cook had gone with with Banks to try and find a place to get out of the reef, a sort of break in the reef, and that was great. But on the way back, we were taken by a young biologist and shown for the first time that I'd ever seen it, coral bleaching. The beautiful coloured corals had bleached to white skeletons because the water had become too warm. And that was my first intimation of the threat to the reef.
Your book is full of stories, like I say, of human encounters with the reef. And a couple of them are these completely amazing castaway stories. You've got a castaway story about a woman who came to be known as Guillaume, I think. Guillaume,
yes.
I beg your pardon. Tell me about her story and how she came to the reef.
Yes, it looks as though she was only about 13 or 14. She'd really run away with a convict who was going to the reef to try and salvage something from an earlier wreck. And they were wrecked again. And her convict, who was her husband, and the other sailors drowned. But she was saved by some indigenous people. This was on the Torres Strait.
And what did they make of this white woman they'd pulled from the water?
Well, they thought she was a ghost of one of the people of their own clan.
Why?
The Kurareg. Well, they had a traditional idea that when they died, they became these white ghostly figures called marki. And one of the old elders recognised, he thought, this woman as his daughter who had drowned earlier and come back, and so they embraced.
Oh my God! It just would blow your mind if you thought that.
That's right. And she's a 13-year-old Scots girl, illiterate, you know. I mean, must have been an extraordinary experience.
It's not your daughter brought back to life. It's your daughter's ghost.
Yes.
What happened then when they found her?
Well, then they adopted her and they treated her very, very well. It's a complicated story, but I'm pretty sure she had a lover, an Indigenous lover, and possibly a child or two. But that has never been made known.
So was she treated as a ghost or as a human, though?
She was treated as a ghost, which was a kind of lesser species, but they were indulgent to her. They would say, she's only a marquee, poor thing. She doesn't know how to mourn properly, for example, when somebody died and the Aboriginal women would scour their body, you know, to give a sense of empathy. She didn't do this because she was a marquee, you know, she didn't understand.
Oh, that's why she didn't know any better.
Yeah, she didn't know any better.
So was she allowed to witness a whole lot of secret business as a result?
Yes, she seemed to have been given very free access. I mean, they had adopted her. They made a kind of pet of her. They gave her an island, actually. And she was not made to work hard, or they looked after her. She became Indigenous to the extent that she could barely remember any of her own language. She used to sing to herself at night just to remember some Scots.
And did she ever try to escape, or was she happy there?
No, she was pretty happy until she saw a ship that was surveying. It was the Rattlesnake, surveying that area, and she saw this ship full of her own people, as it was. And then she was overcome with a kind of strong sense of nostalgia, and she persuaded the Indigenous people to take her and return her to these Europeans.
And what happened when she got on deck of this, back on deck as this Aboriginalised ghost white woman?
She was very lucky in a way. There was an extremely sensitive artist on board who was very interested in Aboriginal life and in Aboriginal myths and so on. And he interviewed her for months in detail about life, the life she'd experienced. And there are 30 volumes, manuscript volumes of her interview.
30 volumes?
Yes.
Wow. All this detailed transcriptions of this woman's life amongst these
all
Aboriginal
the
people
rituals,
in North Queensland.
How they cooked, how they baked, all the environments, the different behaviours. It's incredible. It's an incredible source.
What language was she speaking at this stage?
She was speaking Kurareg, it's called, Kaurareg, which is one of the people from the Torres Strait.
And how long did it take for her to get back to English again, I wonder?
She picked up her English, I think, within a few months, once she was aboard, back on board. But she was with them for 5 years.
What about the husband she may or may not have had? Was he was left behind?
He was pretty grumpy about the whole business. Yeah, there's a guy called Baroto, and he was a very distinguished and sort of important man in the community, and he wasn't too happy that she'd been taken away.
What did they make of these ships then? What did they think they were? These
ghost ships.
Oh, right. So they might have thought she'd returned to her ghost people then, or something.
They definitely thought that. They definitely thought she'd gone back to her ghost people. And in fact, there's a beautiful painting done by Brearley, this artist, in which he represents the Rattlesnake as a ghostly ship, because he'd really got to understand the mores and the values and the lifestyle that she'd had there. This
must be an invaluable document, this transcript. I mean, incredible.
It is extraordinary.
Transcript of life, Aboriginal life in the mid-19th century then.
With beautiful sketches as well.
So what happened when the ship returned to Sydney with her on board, this Aboriginalised white woman? How was she greeted?
The sailors, not the sailors but the officers, I think had decided that they were going to keep very quiet about her private life, because they thought she would be treated as a sensation, and treated very badly because she'd had a black lover. So they really played down the whole story. There was a very short small story about her having been rescued. It was just a few columns, and that was it.
And what became of her after she was returned to Sydney?
She married. She married again, and she lived there happily in Sydney till the age of 80-something, 85, I think.
On air, online, and on your mobile. You're listening to Conversations with Richard Feidler on ABC Radio. Subscribe to our free podcast service. Details on our website abc.net.au/conversations.
I'm with Ian McCalman. Ian is an historian and author. He's the professorial researcher in history at the University of Sydney and co-director of the Sydney Environment Institute. He's the author of a book called The Reef, A Passionate History, which has become an international bestseller. It's the story of the Great Barrier Reef and 12 human encounters with it over the centuries. Another great story of a castaway you've got in this book is about a French boy called Narcisse Peltier. He was from France. How on earth did he end up at the Reef?
Yeah, this is my favourite story, really, Richard. I love this story. Look, he was a kid who was went to sea at the age of 8.
And this is the mid-19th century,
yes,
thereabouts, right?
Yes, we're talking about by the time he was shipwrecked here in 1838. So he grows up in the early 19th century, and he's a sailor, but he is on a ship as a cabin boy at the age of 14 that comes trading to Australia and is shipwrecked. He's actually shipwrecked near New Guinea on one of the islands there. What happens is that the French crew, the adults, the crew, get in a small longboat to escape and go and, they say, get help, and they try to escape. But this boy, whom they're leaving behind, swims out to the boat and crawls on board, and so they take him on board, and they eventually, after a lot of drifting and, drinking their own urine and having a very unpleasant time, they eventually make it to shore through the reef, fairly far up in Cape York, about midway. And he's in a very bad way. They all are, actually, but he's in a particularly bad way. He's kind of wounded, and he's desperately thirsty and hungry. And they find some water and lap it up, and there's none for him, so they tell him to stay there and sleep while they go back to
Right,
the
they keep
boat.
trying to abandon him to die by the sound of things. Yeah, so they leave him.
They leave him.
Who found him?
He's found by 2 naked warriors from the Wantala tribe, and these people treat him really well. I mean, he's terrified at first, but they put out their hands to kind of make him understand that they mean no harm. And then they give him food and water. And one of them adopts him. There's a man who doesn't have children. He adopts him and calls him uncle. So this little kid from 14 then lives with this community for 17 years and becomes a completely indigenous person.
In what way? How was he sort of brought into the customs of the tribe?
He was initiated properly. He had the big scarifications on his chest and on the top of his shoulders. He had an elongated ear with a big ear plug in it. He was naked. He was an expert with the spears and especially hunting dugong, and he's an expert boat builder. I'm pretty sure he had a wife and kids. Some red-headed kids turned up a long time.
This French kid from Marseille ends up as this kind of Cape York warrior.
Absolutely. In fact, he fought in several encounters with rival tribes and claimed much later to have killed at least 2 people in these fights.
Wow. So how did his time on the reef come to an end after 17 years?
Well, in a tragic sort of way, because what had happened is that bêche de mer fishermen were starting to penetrate to this remote part of the world, and they anchored there to get some water, a European ship, and saw this copper-coloured man, completely naked with his spear, and they decided he was a white man and that they would rescue him at gunpoint, which they did, and they actually had to chain him up. He didn't want to join them at all, and made several attempts to escape.
Oh, so he was properly abducted then?
He was abducted.
And where was he taken once he was put on the ship?
Well, first he was taken to Somerset, then to Sydney. He was a bit of a celebrity because he had this savage look, as they said, and he was photographed. That's how we know how he looked. And then he was taken back to France, back to his little fishing village where his family were. Initially, he was unable to speak French at all. He couldn't remember anything. He beat his head like this to try and remember. He only spoke and thought in Wantala. He was, as a later person who interviewed him said, no longer a Frenchman. He was an Australian.
And what did his parents make of him, the sight of this boy?
His parents were, it seems, pretty horrified. They thought he had turned into a savage, and the first thing they did was to take him to a Catholic church and have him sort of have him purged.
Exercised?
Well, exercised, yeah, technically.
Wow.
And he didn't really get on with his family as a result. He became a lone, rather sombre and angry young man, very, very nostalgic for the sand beaches of Cape York. And they gave him a job as a lighthouse keeper, so he hardly spoke to anybody and just stared out to sea nostalgically.
Oh, that's so sad.
It's really,
that's
really
incredibly sad. He was, fit for no one's company then.
That's right. And he died, in effect, of no particular cause. And people assumed it was of a broken heart, of a kind of form of nostalgia for his homeland.
Oh, that's incredibly sad.
It's a very sad story.
The cover of your book has these beautiful, beautiful lithographic images of fish, all the fish that can be found on the reef. It's just lovely. The man who created those beautiful illustrations was called William Savile Kent. Why do you think he's so important in the understanding of the reef?
I think he's important for two or three reasons, Richard. He's not well known here at all, but he is really the first trained reef scientist. He was employed by the Queensland government late in life, and he worked on the reef, especially around the Torres Strait, trying to rectify the fact that so many resources were already being exhausted, especially pearl and pearl shell. But he's important in a second way because he was also an artist, and he was the first person to ever convey to anybody, anywhere, the incredible beauty and variegation of colour and shape and size of the Great Barrier Reef. And his paintings are extraordinary. He also photographed them.
He published this book on the Great Barrier Reef in 1893, which was published in Europe, Britain and in Europe. How well received was it?
It was extremely well received. I mean, there was rave reviews, really. Although it was an extremely expensive book, it's an enormous book. I've got a facsimile copy. It's an absolute treasure of a book, even now. But there's another side to Savile Kent that I need to mention because I think it's really important. He, as a child, had participated with his older sister, who was then 15, in a murder of his half-brother, a baby half-brother, 3.5-year-old half-brother. The two children killed the brother at night and cut his throat. And they did so because they had been given a terrible time by their father and their stepmother. These days we would see them as abused children, really. The older sister, confessed in order that her younger brother could go free and have a job, and the older sister then spent 22 years in prison. She was initially condemned to be executed, but then spent 22 years in prison.
All right, so she said it was just me alone.
It was just me, yeah.
And not my brother.
Yeah.
Well, what did he do while she was in prison for all that time?
Well, sadly, he completely ignored her. She desperately wanted him to visit her and so on, but what he did was to get on with making a scientific career for himself.
And how did he end up in Australia then?
Well, what happened really was that she was due to come out of prison, and she contacted him to say that she was coming out of prison. And I think he was terrified. He was terrified that if she came out of prison angry at his behaviour, she had nothing to lose. She could denounce him. And so he ran away. In effect, he got a job in Australia, in Tasmania, and brought all his half-brothers and sisters out here.
What did he make of life in Australia and once he got up to Queensland, life in the north along the reef?
Well, I think two wonderful things happened to him in Queensland. One is he had a reconciliation with his sister. I think his sister came and lived with him for a while. She then went and became a nurse and had a long and distinguished nursing career under a false name. But he also fell in love with the Great Barrier Reef. He had a very stitched-up, wounded personality, as you could imagine. But going to the reef, here he was, an artist and a scientist, finding just the most beautiful place on earth. And I think it transformed his personality. It redeemed him. So the Barrier Reef, not only was it described by him and painted by him, but it gave something back to him in a kind of psychic redemption.
That's a beautiful story. What became of him in the end? Did he have to return to England after a while?
Yes, his wife wasn't happy. He loved Australia. And wanted to stay here.
Oh, she was homesick.
She was homesick and went back. He came back on a separate occasion and actually worked in Western Australia and wrote another book about naturalists' life in Western Australia. Actually, when he died, he was working on finding artificial pearls. And people think he might have actually been the first person to find an artificial pearl, but he died before he turned it into a kind of manufacturing success.
Now we get onto the whole idea of the reef as this transformative place. It has the power to really transform the soul of people who go there. And
absolutely
undo certain knots that are within them and change them and redirect all their energy and personality. And for that we need to talk about a man called Ted Banfield and his wife Bertha. How is he important to the larger story of the reef?
Ted Banfield is really important to the reef because he's the first person to communicate to the world that the reef was a paradise, not a place of horror. And it seems odd. I mean, it was very late in life. His book, which was called The Confessions of a Beachcomber and became a bestseller in its time in Australia and in America and in Britain, was in 1928. And that was the first book that really, really sold the story of the reef as a paradise.
How did he become a castaway, a sort of self-inflicted castaway or a self-devising castaway on Dunk Island?
Well, he was a journo. He was a journalist in Townsville who really had a pretty unsuccessful career there. He became very depressed. He had lost his top job to someone else, and he just felt he wasn't getting anywhere. And he started, I think he became technically depressed and started to wither away. They thought he had some kind of wasting disease. He was losing weight, unable to sleep, tremendously alienated and unhappy. And his wife suggested that they go to an island to try to restore his health. So they went to Dunk Island and they ended up buying about half of Dunk Island.
And what happened when they got there? What sort of a shack did they set up for themselves?
Well, they met one of the few original indigenous people still alive, who'd grown up on Dunk Island, called Tom, and he adopted them and they him, and he helped them live there. He fished for them, taught them the indigenous ways and the indigenous places, the magic places in Dunk Island. They built a little shack, and it became a kind of a symbol for Ted of going back to nature, becoming a beachcomber, a person who fell in love with the water, with the coral, with the fish, with the wonderful forests.
How did it transform him? He'd gone there as this sickly guy who was only given however many months to live. How did he physically transform once after he arrived there?
He started to swim every day and run everywhere. He wore shorts the whole year, so he was absolutely brown. He had a sort of cowboy moustache. He put on weight. He became muscular. He could work all day. So, I mean, physically, he was utterly transformed. So he became a kind of living example of what he called the tonic of the sea and the tonic of the sun.
Oh, that sounds very Australian all of a sudden, doesn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. So he called this the beachcomber's life.
Yes.
What would we recognise that as today, do you think?
Well, I suppose we'd still call him a beach bum, wouldn't we? But he was in some way a kind of artist because he started to write about this stuff, write about what life was like living as a beachcomber. So we would see him as a modern-day artist who'd gone troppo, I suppose. By
the 1960s, and there's a great story here of this period when the reef was under threat. There was talk of mining it or repurposing it and dredging it up and using it for all sorts of different industrial and mining purposes. But a group of unlikely heroes came riding to the rescue there to save the reef. Please tell me that story.
Yes, it's a lovely story, Richard. They were, you're right to connect them to Banfield because in some senses they were followers in his footsteps. The three people who got together to try to save the reef were unlikely figures to be able to do so. One was Judith Wright.
The poet.
Yes. The other was a guy called Buist, John Buist, who was a bohemian artist, what they called an escape artist, who'd escaped to the island at Badara Island, lived a very unbuttoned life there. And the third one was a slightly mystical scientist, a forester and scientist called Len Webb, who grew up largely in Brisbane and went to university here. But became an expert on the rainforests, the tropical rainforests of Queensland.
And what were they up against?
They were up against the Queensland government, a very, very manic developer government in the form of Joe Bjelke-Petersen. They were up against a whole series of major oil and other kinds of and gas companies, international gas companies. Bjelke-Petersen had zoned 80% of the reef for mining. They were hoping to find oil there. They were also intending to mine it and had started to mine it just as fertilizer, beating down the coral and putting it on sugar to fertilize it and use it also for concrete, making concrete.
Now, to them, I suppose, this poets and a bohemian and a scientist would have looked to them just like nuts, wouldn't they? They would have looked like hippie nuts.
Oh, they called them cranks and rat bags and God knows what.
Yeah, but your man John Buist there had friends in high places, didn't he?
He did. John Buist had grown up with Harold Holt. They'd gone to school together and then to uni together, and then John dropped out, became a bohemian painter in Melbourne. But he was always friends with the Holts, and the Holts fell in love with the reef because they stayed with the Buists. And so much so, as you probably know, Harold Holt was a skin diver, that they bought a house round the corner from the Buists. So when the reef was threatened, one of the first things that our friend John Buist did was to go down and collar Harold Holt and tell him, "You've got to stop this, mate."
This was a kind of long process that carried over into several governments in the end.
Yes.
What was the decision in the end that saved the reef from exploitation like that?
Well, the decision in the end was to make it a national park, a national marine park, and that was made really by a bipartisan government decision of the Liberals and the Labor Party. So both had a role in that, and it was made a national reserve in that sense, a national marine park in 1975, and then became in 1983 a World Heritage Park, one of the the most valued World Heritage spots on the planet.
This, I suppose, is how you trace the long arc from that, from someone like William Savile Kent, who did those drawings, who released that book to the wider world. This growing idea that the whole world is responsible for the Great Barrier Reef, not the one village, not the one state, not the one nation, but the whole world is responsible for the reef's
I think
well-being.
that's right. And of course we think that even more now that we know how much the biodiversity of the entire Pacific depends on the Great Barrier Reef, because it is the great fount of fertility in the Pacific. We realise that the whole world does depend to an extent on the reef. But I think people adopted the reef partly because they came here as tourists, they read about it, but they adopted it in the way that all of us adopt any of the wonders of the world. We see them as belonging to mankind rather than to an individual country.
Your final hero in the book is a man called Charlie Veron. Tell me his story and how he became associated with the reef.
Charlie is an incredible guy. So he's still living in Townsville, where he's lived for a great deal of his life. He was pretty much a self-made scientist. I mean, he did go to uni and he did get a PhD, but he did so entirely on his own. You know, he was a follower of nature, a lover of nature like Darwin. He got the name Charlie as a nickname when he was 6 after Darwin, and he's been known as Charlie ever since. But he came to Townsville when the university was established, and he was their first professional reassercher. He was told to go out there and do something.
That was it. Go out there and do something, right?
He couldn't, fathom what was going on. He had these books that told him about coral, and when he dived underwater, it was nothing like the books, because they hadn't been made by people who'd seen living coral. So his first challenge was to map living corals, which he did for a very long time. He spent 7,000 hours diving on the reef. I mean, there's probably not a spot in the whole reef that Charlie Veron hasn't seen.
He made this speech that attracted worldwide headlines in 2009 to the Royal Society in London, the famous, very, very old Society of Scientists, and it was introduced by David Attenborough. Just explain what the gist of his speech was and how it went over with the crowd.
Charlie was telling them something that a lot of people still don't realise, that the Great Barrier Reef and corals are the canaries of climate change. The canaries, like the canaries that used to be taken down the mines, and if they could smell any toxic gases, the little canary would keel over before the humans got troubled. Well, in a sense, that's what is happening with the reefs. And the coral reefs, and particularly the barrier reef, as far as Charlie was concerned, are showing us just what a dangerous situation we are creating with climate change.
He said it was like seeing a house on fire in slow motion. That's how dire things were. It's always hard as lay people to know what to make of these dire warnings that the reef will be almost inert in 30 years or thereabouts. Yes. It's very hard to know what to make of that because we've heard dire prognostications before. Nonetheless, is there a kind of growing consensus around that idea, Ian, or is there not?
There is consensus about it. I mean, of course, with these we're talking about quite long-term processes. It's not as though the reef is going to suddenly explode. Although one of the ones that is most instant and spectacular is heating, the water heating. And we're in an El Nino, going into an El Nino year, we will get terrible coral bleaching.
What happens? Yes, explain what happens as the water heats to or
what
warms
happens
up to
is
the coral.
That coral is actually a symbiosis with a little plant, and the little plant needs light to create photosynthesis. Imagine a little tree inside the coral. It's that tree that gives the extra energy and colour and everything that is needed to be able to build a huge wall against the forces of the sea. And what happens is that little coral, let's call it a solar panel, inside the coral can't cope with heated water. It only needs to go up. The barrier reef needs to get 1.5 degrees more than its usual evolved time, and these little creatures leave, and they leave a bleached white skeleton.
Right, so they leave and the coral polyp dies?
It becomes a skeleton. It can revive in time if the warming would go away, but the warming keeps on. It does die. Yeah.
How about the process of acidification in the ocean?
That's the elephant in the room, or as I would like to say, the blue whale in the fish pond. Acidification is not something we understand terribly well, but what we do know is that the seawater of the world is becoming more acid. It's absorbing the CO2 and the methane in the atmosphere, and it absorbs it and absorbs it and absorbs it, but it gets to a point where it can't absorb anymore without undergoing a chemical change. In effect, it's become carbonic acid. And when it becomes carbonic acid, it's got to, just like when you get acid indigestion, you need an alkali, you need to take an Alka-Seltzer tablet, then it's got to dissolve an alkali, and what it does is it starts to dissolve calcium. And coral is limestone, it's made of calcium. So coral is starting to dissolve. The skeletons are becoming brittle. They've got osteoporosis, in effect. But it's not only corals. It's the tiny little phytoplankton on which krill feed. Blue whale feed on krill. The whole food chain is affected by acidification. That's what's so scary. It's not only the reef that we've got to worry about. It's the whole ocean.
Your book has really taken off in America, and President Obama made reference to the Great Barrier Reef while he was in Australia. What's the American view of the Great Barrier Reef?
Well, a lot of Americans have been here as tourists, a remarkable number. But also, they seem to have a very almost a proprietorial feel about it. It's partly because...
Oh dear, that's normally a bit worrisome when Americans feel that way.
It's more, I think, because the Florida reefs are very similar to the Great Barrier Reef, although they're much smaller.
Are they a bit like, what's our reef doing on their coast?
Yeah. But I've been very impressed, I suppose, by how seriously the book has been taken in the States. I mean, given that it is an Australian story, as we would see it, it really has been very, very well reviewed and looked after in that way. They care about the reef.
It's been wonderful to speak with you, Ian. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Richard. It's been terrific.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Richard Fidler. For more Conversations interviews, please go to the website abc.net.au/conversations.